Let me be blunt. There's a massive cover-up going on in the Justice Department to protect Donald Trump and people associated with Jeffrey Epstein.
That is the Senate Minority Leader calling what's happening at the Department of Justice a massive cover-up to protect the president. And what makes that statement more than political rhetoric is what was discovered this week in the Epstein files. More than 50 pages of FBI documents containing sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump that were found to be missing from the legally mandated public release. They appeared in internal indexes. They were not in the public database. And the question of who removed them and why is now the subject of a congressional subpoena that 5 Republicans voted to enforce against their own Attorney General. The last time a presidential administration was accused of systematically removing documents to protect the president from a criminal investigation, it was 1973. The documents were White House tape recordings. The president was Richard Nixon. And the 18.5 minutes that were erased from one of those tapes became one of the most infamous acts of obstruction in American history. Not because of what was on the tape, we still don't know what was said during those missing minutes, but because the act of erasing them proved that someone inside the administration knew the contents were damaging enough to justify destruction. The erasure was the evidence. 53 years later, we are looking at the same pattern with different technology. More than 50 pages of FBI interview summaries related to sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump were found in the internal indexes of the Department of Justice's Epstein document database. They were cataloged, they were referenced, they existed. But when journalists from NPR and the New York Times searched the public-facing database, the one that the Epstein Files Transparency Act legally required to be complete, those 50 pages were not there. They had been removed or withheld from the mandatory public release, and just like Nixon's missing 18.5 minutes, the removal itself is now the scandal, because it proves that someone inside the Department of Justice knew those documents were significant enough to suppress. What happened next is remarkable. To understand why this specific set of missing documents matters more than any other revelation from the Epstein files, you need to understand what they contain and what their absence proves about the administration's handling of this investigation. The documents are FBI interview summaries, official records created by federal agents during the course of an investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking operation. Within those summaries, a woman alleges that Donald Trump sexually abused her as a minor after being introduced to him by Jeffrey Epstein. The FBI reviewed the allegation and found it, quote, unsubstantiated. Trump has denied all wrongdoing in connection with Epstein. Those facts are part of the record, and they matter. But here's what matters more. The FBI's determination that the allegation was unsubstantiated does not explain why the documents were removed from the public database. An unsubstantiated allegation is not a classified document. It is not protected by national security concerns. It is not exempt from the transparency requirements of the Epstein Files Transparency Act. If anything, an unsubstantiated allegation would be the easiest document to release. The FBI already determined it didn't meet evidentiary standards. The administration could have released it and pointed to the FBI's own finding as proof that Trump was cleared. Instead, someone removed it. Someone looked at a document that contained the FBI's own conclusion that the allegation was unsubstantiated and decided that the public should not be allowed to see it. That decision to suppress a document that arguably helps Trump's case only makes sense if someone determined that the document contained details beyond the FBI's bottom-line conclusion. That would be politically damaging. The contents were significant enough to hide even when the conclusion was favorable. That tells you more about what's in those 50 pages than any summary ever could. Now stop and think about what that means for the broader investigation. On March 5, 2026, after sustained pressure from media outlets and congressional Democrats, the DOJ published some of the missing files, but Democrats on the House Oversight Committee say millions of pages remain concealed. That number, millions, is not rhetorical. The Epstein Files Transparency Act required the release of the full document, archive. The DOJ has released a fraction, And the documents that have been found to be missing are not random gaps in a bureaucratic process. They are specifically the documents that reference the President of the United States. When the pattern of what's missing maps precisely onto what would be most damaging to one person, the explanation that this is an administrative oversight becomes functionally impossible to maintain. Here's why that distinction matters for what happened next in Congress. On March 4, 2026, one day before the DOJ released the missing files under pressure, the House Oversight Committee voted 24-19 to subpoena Attorney General Pam Bondi to testify under oath about the department's handling of the Epstein documents. That vote required Republican support to succeed. 5 Republicans broke with their own party and voted alongside every Democrat on the committee: Nancy Mace, Lauren Boebert, Scott Perry, Tim Burchett, Michael Cloud. 5 members of the president's own party voted to force his attorney general to explain under oath why documents about the president were missing from a legally mandated release. That is not a routine oversight action. That is an institutional fracture. When 5 members of the president's party determine that the cover-up allegations are serious enough to override party loyalty, it signals that the political cost of protecting the administration has exceeded the political cost of breaking ranks, and the polling confirms why. Representative Robert Garcia, the ranking member of the Oversight Committee, stated on camera that Epstein accountability is polling at over 70% with Republican voters. He called it, quote, the single most bipartisan issue that's popular amongst both parties. And then he said something that should define the administration's political calculus going forward. He said, quote, it's Trump's worst political issue. He's more unpopular on Epstein than he is on issues around the economy and healthcare. Look at the broader approval numbers. Economist and YouGov. March 6th, 38% approve, 58% disapprove. New York Times, March 6th, 41% approve, 56% disapprove. Rasmussen, typically Trump's friendliest pollster, 45% approve, 54% disapprove. CivvyKeys, 39% approve, 57% disapprove. NBC News, 44% approve, 54% disapprove. Across every major poll, approval ranges between 36 and 45%, with disapproval reaching as high as 63%. These are not midterm survivable numbers. And the issue driving the most intense bipartisan opposition, Epstein, is the one where the administration has been most aggressively suppressing information. Let's connect these dots to the timeline that has raised the most explosive question of all. The DOJ's handling of the Epstein files became a dominant story in late February 2026 as media outlets discovered the gaps in the release. The missing Trump-related documents were identified. Congressional pressure was building. The subpoena of Bondi was being organized. And then, on February 28, 2026, the United States launched Operation Epic Fury, a massive joint military strike with Israel against Iran. Within 48 hours, the Epstein story was buried under wall-to-wall war coverage. Google searches for Epstein files dropped sharply as Iran dominated every news cycle. Senator Schumer called it what many were thinking: a massive cover-up. Hillary Clinton, in a BBC interview, said, quote, what we're seeing, I think it's fair to say, is a continuing cover-up by the Trump administration. Get the files out? They are slow walking it. The House Oversight Democrats issued an official statement calling it, quote, the largest government cover-up in modern history. Now, the administration's defense has multiple layers, and it is important to lay them out clearly. Trump has stated, quote, I have nothing to hide. I have been exonerated. I have nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein. The White House maintains that the files clear Trump. Attorney General Bondi testified before the House Judiciary Committee but, according to reports, refused to answer key questions, diverted attention from document-specific inquiries, and according to Hillary Clinton, quote, refused to look at the survivors. The DOJ claims that redactions and withheld materials are necessary for privacy and ongoing investigations. a rationale that has satisfied essentially no one on either side of the aisle. And Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has visibly struggled under questioning from reporters when pressed on the document gaps, snapping at media when the questions became too specific. Each layer of this defense has the same structural weakness. It does not explain why documents that appeared in internal indexes were absent from the public database. Privacy doesn't explain it. Ongoing investigations don't explain it. And exoneration certainly doesn't explain it. Because if the documents exonerated Trump, there would be no reason to remove them. And here's the part nobody's talking about yet. The scope of the officials implicated in the Epstein files extends deep into the current administration. Kevin Warsh, Trump's pick for Federal Reserve Chair, is named in the files. Howard Lutnick's photograph appeared in the Epstein documents, and reporting indicates that efforts were made to suppress that information. Garcia confirmed that the committee has, quote, a very long list of administration officials they intend to subpoena. And the precedent that makes all of this possible was established by Republicans themselves. Chairman James Comer brought Bill and Hillary Clinton before the committee to testify about their connections to Epstein. That precedent now applies to every administration official and, critically, to the president himself. Garcia stated directly, quote, Donald Trump will be in front of our committee. Whether he comes in now and he tries to defy us while he's president, he's not going to be the president forever. He added that the precedent extends to first ladies as well. The constitutional stakes could not be higher. If evidence establishes that the Department of Justice deliberately removed documents from a legally mandated public release to protect the president from allegations contained in those documents, it constitutes obstruction of justice at the highest level of the federal government. The question is not whether the allegation against Trump is true or false. The FBI has already weighed in on that. The question is whether the DOJ suppressed the documentation of that allegation to prevent the public and Congress from seeing the full record. That is a question about the integrity of the justice system itself. It is a question about whether a president's Department of Justice can use its control over federal documents to shield the president from accountability. And it is a question that Pam Bondi will now be required to answer under oath, with 5 members of the president's own party having voted to compel her testimony. When you step back and look at this from the vantage point of history, certain moments define the relationship between a president and the institutions that are supposed to hold power accountable. Nixon's missing 18.5 minutes. Clinton's statements under oath. Now, potentially, the missing 50 pages from Trump's Epstein files. In each case, the cover-up became bigger than the original allegation. In each case, the institutional response, congressional subpoenas, bipartisan pressure, demands for testimony under oath, determined whether the system held or whether it broke. 50 years from now, historians will look at the vote of March 4, 2026, the 24-19 vote, where 5 Republicans broke with their president to subpoena his attorney general over missing documents, as either the moment the system began to hold, or the last moment it had the chance to. Bondi will testify. The questions are on the record. The missing pages have been identified, and the American public polling at over 70% bipartisan support for full accountability is watching to see whether the institutions they built will function as designed, or whether the documents that someone removed from the Epstein files will remain the most consequential thing the public was never meant to see.